Welcome back. In this segment, we will discuss the nitrogen cycle in a little more detail. We ended with, the last section was one of my favorite little lecture segments on the decay of brown rot, how white rot decay and things like that, and how these fungi do that, catching nematodes and all sorts of microbes. I think the oyster mushrooms actually make these little sticky cells that they push into bacterial pools and just digest those bacteria on the outside of the hyphae and then sop up the juice. There's a lot going on in that wood. Anyway, lignin is important and it is broken down, but again, it's not for the carbon. It is done by fungi. Bacteria can't do it. But there are pools of the microbes in there, and those are pools of nitrogen. That's what the fungi are after. So let's look at this nitrogen cycle a little bit more. This is out of your book 21.7, and there's a couple of important features I want you to think about when you see this. Now, we could look at all of the cycling that's going on in this image. If you take a microbiology class, you'll get into a lot of bacterial systems, and how does nitrogen gas get converted into ammonium by the bacteria that do it? How does ammonium get converted to nitrite, NO2 minus, or to nitrate, NO3 minus, or NO, nitrous oxide, or N-gas, right? These things are happening not by accident, but they're using the bonds that are in these different molecules and getting energy out of them. And it's in a way that is rather unique and not particularly efficient compared to using light to make glucose in a photosynthetic machinery. This stuff it's happening. We don't do it. We are relying on the bacteria, and we get the byproducts, NH4, ammonium, or nitrite. But really, we're after the ammonium, and that's what feeds our amino acid machinery, ammonium. Come back to that. But the microbes are hugely important, and we have to pay homage to them, large charismatic microbes. One thing to think about is I was on a NSF review panel that was looking at compost nutrient cycling, and they were very interested in the nitrogen cycles, and they found that when these compost piles were cranking along, it wasn't all benign. We like to think the composting is super helpful. It is, but they're also pushing out nitrous NO2 and NO3, nitrates, nitrites, and gases, and they wind up being powerful greenhouse gases. Or they feed into other transformations that make powerful greenhouse gases. Not N2, but nitrous oxide and others. So, yeah, that's an important feature I wanted to have you keep in mind. So the other important thing is, look at nitrogen fixation up here. We talk about nitrogen fixing plants. I've said this in an early lecture. There is no such thing as a nitrogen fixing plant. Some of you are thinking, wait a minute, what about the pea plants? What about clover? What about having a fallow farm where you put in clover or pea plants or some other legume to increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil, pulling it out of the air and making rich soil with ammonium and nitrate. Remember, those plants have bacteria, rhizobia, in their roots. The alder plants have bacteria in their roots. The plants can't do it. Okay? They are being friendly with things that can. They're nitrogen starved, so they've evolved a way to get more nitrogen. They have huge need for nitrogen, more than most plants, and that's why they've gone down this, quote, symbiotic pathway. Okay, so bacteria, very important for getting nitrogen gas. 70% of the nitrogen in the atmosphere is this N2, or 70% of the gas is N2, right? So there's a ton of it, but we breathe it in and we breathe it out, and we're done. It does nothing, right? But the bacteria are putting it into usable forms for us. And then down here is further activity by the bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, denitrification. We have to be able to convert these things around. Here's the nitrous oxide. That's the greenhouse gas also, by the way. So once you get into this region, there are other microbes that use this and then crank out the greenhouse gases. But I just kind of left it over here for that factor of the greenhouse gases. Okay, and then you could look, there's assimilation. That's what we're doing. We take up this stuff. We eat plants. We eat organisms that have eaten plants. And we're utilizing that assimilation of the products of the bacteria. Then everything gets broken down and recycles. All right, you don't have to have it go back into the gas state. And two, it can recycle within the litter and does quite a bit. And this is also happening in the waters. Materials leaching into the soils feeds the producers and the consumers, and they decompose, and then you get anaerobic, and then you get nitrogen fixation, and blah, blah, blah. The other thing is cyanobacteria, our bacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, but they're bacteria, and they're superbugs. They not only fix nitrogen, they fix carbon. So they got everything. Those bacteria can do everything that a nitrogen-fixing plant can in one cell. The nitrogen-fixing plant can't even do it on its own. It's got to be associated with a bacterium that can. Right. There is a little bit of nitrogen that comes from lightning, a lot from combustion, and a lot more from fertilizers, right? So let's look at that in a minute. So I can't say enough, and I generally don't say enough. Probably I say enough for you guys, but bacteria are critical here. This is from a different book. I don't want you to memorize this nitrogen cycle using this kind of schematic, but get the idea that, if you do take a course in microbiology, there's some really interesting things going on. And here are some of the names of the bacteria that are involved. Nitrobacter, Nitrococcus, get the idea that it's part of the nitrogen cycle. Pseudomonas, here's Nitrosococcus, they ran out of names. Pseudomonas you probably have run into. Rhizobium, Azotobacter, and there's our friend Frankia, I added it in. So you begin to see the organisms involved, and they have very different sort of niches. So you're going from most oxidized state of the nitrogen compound to the most reduced. So you go from non-organic to organic nitrogen, and you have to have energy to do it. And then you have ammonification over to ammonium, and other ways to get to the ammonium through nitrogen, and then our nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And then things start to go back to a oxidized state, low energy state, nitrate. And the other important thing to see, I'm not going to worry, I want you guys to worry about what is the difference between nitrification and denitrification and all these things. I think it would be important for you to know what nitrogen fixation is to some degree. But the other interesting thing is this grayish box is all occurring in the aerobic area where oxygen is present. All right? This is in the anaerobic, and this is, look how, it's a little bit more busy because a lot of this occurs in anaerobic settings, in mud flats, soils, down at the bottom of waterways, down in the sediment. And so that's quite important and quite unique habitats. And these guys have figured out a way to eke out a living using the nitrogen, also the carbon, but that's another story, under anaerobic conditions. Okay, so here is a figure out of your book. I did not put the figure number down, but it's there. Looking at teragrams of nitrogen in the system, in soils, from 1900 out to 2000, okay? And what I hope you notice is that green line. I'm going to show it to you for those of you who don't see the green. Right here. So total reactive N, that is available to plants. And I've listed it, and often it's listed as plant available N, which I always get a kick out of. But anyway, plant available N, total available to plants, total reactive N is up here, and it's been growing since the 60s, or actually the 40s, okay? Look at the nitrogen fixing crops right here. That's this line. It's been plugging along at a very low level. Not a whole lot going on. We're adding nitrogen through fossil fuel combustion, okay? And that's not helpful. This is leading to deposition, acid rain, things like that with the nitrous oxide, nitric acid. But this line seems to be driving the total. And that line is industrial fixed, mainly fertilizer nitrogen, ammonium nitrate, okay? And this is a huge story. We are in no way done with this one. And those of you who are looking at research topics down the road for a career, I recommend this one. There are others coming down the pike, and there are a lot of people working on this one already. So it could get a little elbowy, but we're not done figuring out what this means for our ecosystems, for our production of crops. Yeah, it's great. We've got tons of corn out there, and anything you pull off the shelf that's in liquid or even solid form has high fructose corn syrup because of the industrial fixed fertilizer. We're cranking out a lot of corn, and that corn now is helping to feed our fructose habits, which is pretty bad in this country. This all became possible because of the Haber-Bosch process. First, Haber figured out a way to, he was a German, and he figured out a way to take the N2 gas and convert it to ammonium. And then Bosch came along a little bit later and said, oh, well, if you tweak it a little bit, you can get ammonium nitrate. And guess what ammonium nitrate is good for? Beyond fertilizers. Look what year this is that this is sort of showing up, or decade. This is during the war effort. And what we had was bombs. And they were cranking it out in this country, the ammonium nitrate. There was a bomber a few years ago that used ammonium nitrate to blow up a building. The stuff is very, very reactive and basically pretty bad stuff. After the war, they had literally tons of it floating around or lying around in, the war effort depots. And they said, well, you know what? Let's not make bombs. Let's make fertilizer. We have all that stuff. So that's where you see right around here, the war ends in 45, and we start using it in our fertilizers. And that's when, and it's been great. People are not, there are still people starving, but people really, the agriculture boom has been, the green revolution has been great. And in large part because of the Haber-Bosch. But we're going to see we are seeing some terrible effects on our human health, but also the ecosystem and global health. So yeah, all of that fertilizer is not so good for the terrestrial or aquatic systems. You've heard about this, and I've highlighted it in earlier lectures already. So here's some data from a variety of, it's another sort of a meta-analysis of a variety of different locations in this case. I don't think these were different studies, but they may have been. I think there are just 23 experiments that these guys did in 8 locations in the US to look at what the effect of the altered nitrogen cycle was on plant communities. And the one thing they noticed is across the board, they got productivity increased greatly, right? By 50%, maybe only 25%, but productivity went right up. And that's considered good. There's a lot of variation, right? Look at those error bars. This is the kind of thing that if a graduate student brought this to me and said, I don't know what to do, how can I reduce that error bar? I'd be saying, why? This tells you there's variation. There's a huge difference between this one and this one. There's no variation here, or at least very little. The data are what they are. Accept that variation. That is informative. I really cringe when I hear people worried about how much error there is in the data. That's not you, that's the system, right? Okay, anyway, productivity increased across the board, but at the same time, species richness was dropping almost across the board. Maybe this study site 6, not much drop in the species richness. But here in this lower orange area, we're looking at species loss by percent, and some of these really lost quite a few species. A couple of them, 3 of them, not so many. So it does vary also. I think that's what the book means by when they say there was variation. I did want to highlight the idea that these error bars are demonstrating variation too, but really you ought not to be too upset about that. So anyway, there is variation in species richness loss, and we've already talked about this. Remember this figure where these guys, now this stuff on the left panel is all about what's been going on in the last 50 years or so, 60 years, since Haber-Bosch has been applied. The products have been applied widely. These guys, remember, started fertilizing in 1856 with 49 species annually, and in those plots, by 1949, almost 100 years later, they're down to 3 species, right? So there's this huge loss in richness and evenness. These are a little bit more even. This is nothing. Virtually everything is made up of 1 species. I don't know which one it is. I hope it's not corn, but it could be. Okay. A little bit more on nitrogen. This is atmospheric deposition. So I've said that the burning of fossil fuels in our automobiles is putting out a lot of nitrogen into the atmosphere. And that comes down as deposition, i.e. rain and snow and sleet and all the other stuff, okay? And you can see that there's a hot spot here in the Bay Area, way over on the left. And of course, the Ohio River Valley and all the industrial complex in this area, Pennsylvania, lots of nitrogen, not just from cars, but from industrial productivity, human production, big stacks, nitrogen exhaust, if you will, and greater than and equal to 2 tons per square mile by county. That's a heck of a lot of nitrogen to be adding to the system. Am I wrong? So we are messing it up in this region. And guess what? This is in our backyard, right? This is a map of the Adirondack parks. Now this is predicted based on a model that was developed using the available data. But here's our Adirondack park, and blue is a lot of nitrogen deposition in kilograms per hectare per year. And there's this kind of wind current right across the Adirondacks. Where's Newcomb? Like here? It's kind of in the middle, isn't it? Our research station, one of our research stations. So we would love to think of this as a pristine forest, but it is reeling under human activity, if you will. And I have done some work in the White Mountains, which is not here. If I'm over on the US map again, not here, but over here, and not as much deposition, but the fungi are definitely reeling as well. We've shown it. They are not doing well. Some species are dropping out of the system under the high nitrogen, but I won't go any further than that. I hope that doesn't have big impacts down the road. All right. Sorry, some of this lecture is sort of the, yeah, we're doomed, people. We're not. We can get smart. We can start fixing things. And that is job security, if nothing else. The carbon cycle. Here's another one that if you think carbon cycle, what are you thinking about? If I put it into the doomsday lecture. Atmospheric CO2, right? So there's a few things I want you to think about, but I want one main lesson out of this portion on the carbon cycle for you to come away with. And that is the atmospheric CO2 levels have not been steady through time on this planet. And I'm going to build on that. So that's not the one thing I want you to think about. I want you to look at where we're headed, what we've done, and where it went. At one time, there was a lot more carbon in our atmosphere than there is today. There were no scientists measuring it, but there were microbes and things and rocks and ice that were recording it. So we know that this was true. Looking at this, again, there's a lot going on here that you don't need to be able to map this whole thing out for my class. I do want you to know a few critical things, though. Calcium carbonate and this is the lesson of the day, I suppose, and you'll see why in a little while, allows for CO2 to come out of the atmosphere, go into the water as dissolved carbon, CO2, sorry, and it complexes with calcium to form this calcium carbonate precipitate, which then falls to the bottom of the ocean. That's going to become important in a little bit. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you look across the board, yeah, okay, we have lots going on out in the ocean, detritivores, scavengers, decomposers, consumers. Some of this plant material got bound up into the oil and coal and other fossil fuels, which we are depleting quickly and spewing it back out into the atmosphere, right? That's the source of our CO2 problem and potentially the global warming problem, although there's a lot more than just CO2 causing the atmosphere to warm up. But this is a big one. It is very important, and we are depleting it. So there's a whole economic question. What are we going to do when it's gone? But also, it helps explain what's going on in the atmosphere today. Okay, what else? Yeah, extracting it from very safe locations back up to use for our industrial complex, but also it's feeding into our CO2 in the atmosphere. Same sort of general cycles on land that you see in the oceans, right? Right, like I said, the extraction of the fossil fuels brings carbon to the surface, and that's causing some interesting features in our global ecosystem. Here's another one of these figures, like I showed with the nitrogen. Looking at carbon transformations, bacteria are again the big players. We do a little bit of respiration, global, little bit as in contribution to the global system, but there's a lot of other organisms that do it also, and including plants and bacteria and fungi and other animals. And then we have the photosynthesis. So these two are kind of coupled between the respiration and the photosynthesis in the aerobic condition. Again, we're going from most oxidized to the most reduced. And then we get to this area where we move over to anaerobic. And again, it gets a lot more complicated. And they don't show you all the microbe names, but there's a lot of things in here that are involved with using like methane for energy rather than CO2, or I should say sugar, carbohydrates. We won't go into that here, but know that that's happening, okay? And it should be very obvious, if it's not already, you should see that linkage between the respiration to photosynthesis. That is, the products of respiration yield to photosynthesis, the products of photosynthesis yield respiration, okay? So how are we measuring the CO2 in the atmosphere? There are a variety of different really cool things that are going on. A lot of them have run their course. They were started before I started my PhD, or maybe during my PhD, some of them, and we've collected a whole lot of data, and we're convinced it's happening. CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. CO2 is causing warming, and that's having effects on our planet. So first look at these. These are the International Tundra Experiments, where they put these little boxes and warm up or add CO2 and look how the plants respond. And here's one example, really well. They grow bigger, right? They love all that CO2, and the warmth that's a good thing. So what's the problem? We'll see in a little bit that it's not that simple, of course. These are called FACE experiments, free air CO2 exchange, and they could be little, like in this little probably prairie habitat, or they could be massive down at Duke, big towers with these bars here that release CO2, and they have these repeated in replications, and basically as the wind blows this way, it releases just enough CO2 to be, say, twice ambient. So whatever's out here with the CO2 in the air, it's twice ambient in here. And as the wind shifts, different bars turn on and release CO2. So they can keep it at a fairly constant twice ambient, or whatever the number is. And then they're going to look, and they have looked at how the plants respond. I've been involved a little bit with how the fungi respond, etc. It's been an amazing study. Very expensive, by the way, but worth it, so worth it. It can't be any less worth it than going to Mars, by the way. Okay, and they're doing the same kinds of things in different ecosystems. And then this study down here, these sets of studies, this is down at Harvard, but there's others, where they're just warming the soil and looking at the effects on plants, on microbes, fungi, other things. And those studies are ongoing today. How fast does decomposition increase with increased warming and things like that? So here's a study in Colorado. It was a grassland, and they warmed it. Well, actually, they added CO2 in one of these free area gas exchanges. And it's basically looking at two different times. Well, summer production of above ground biomass in grams per square meter, or the annual production. Green was control, that's just out away from the experimental setup. Ambient was supposed to be like the control conditions, but it included the setup. Whatever pieces of hardware they put in there, people walking around, measuring, doing things like that. And so you see that there was an increase in production, both summer and annual, just by having the equipment in the area. But when they added CO2, they got a lot more growth, both in the summer when growth is highest in Colorado, but overall for the entire year as well. Okay, so that's good, right? Plants should grow. We like them growing bigger. And in this area, if you could look at that image over on the top right, this is fodder for cattle. So that's good, right? We want more cattle. We want more burgers. Okay. It ain't so good. Because what happened is they looked at it and parsed it out by the different plant species from Bechulo, I don't know how to pronounce this, Poa and Stipa, different grasses. They all sort of had their own variations, but this one, this comata, S. comata, really grew big. And it turned out that's what was driving the increased biomass was comata, largely. And more importantly, for this discussion at this point, livestock don't like it. Actually, they don't like it. And so they didn't have livestock in the system, but when they tried, feeding habits, no, you might have a lot of growth and increased growth, but it's not the kind that you need for your fodder, which is an interesting sort of twist. You don't always have what you think you have when you collect these data. All right. Then we have the overall atmospheric pattern through the years. So here's a guy looking at some ice. It's an ice core, probably from Alaska. It could be from Antarctica. And he could identify the different layers and what year they were deposited. And then inside there are gas bubbles. And then using some pretty fancy chemical techniques, could figure out how much CO2 was in the atmosphere based on that gas. It wasn't just measuring CO2, though. I don't think. It may have been, but I don't think so. Back 400,000 years ago. So this is about when plants are colonizing land, just to put it in perspective. But you can see it's just sort of this breathing going on with the CO2, right? These are CO2 parts per million. High, drops down, goes up, drops down, goes up. Some annual fluctuations, or I guess not annual, decadal, I don't know, 100-year, going on as well. That's one thing, but then look at this. About time humans arrive and start doing their thing, it goes way up to far higher than anything that we've had in recent history, right? So CO2 levels in our atmosphere fluctuate greatly, but there is currently 31% higher amount of CO2 in the atmosphere than in the past 400,000 years. Anybody who claims they know that the CO2 problem isn't a problem isn't paying attention, if you will. This is a problem. It's a very rapid increase. We have to pay attention to it. And to dig into this a little bit farther, You think we have a CO2 problem now. It was 20 times higher 450 million years ago than it is today, but where did it all go, right? So right now we're, 350 parts per million? It's rapidly increasing. When I started doing science, it was in the 200s, but I'm not that old, and yet we're seeing huge blips, and you can see maybe the hint of this older figure that it's going up further again. But look at what it was 450 million years ago. Remember, this is when plants colonized land, right? Before this, land was barren. So anything that's up in this region was from volcanic activity, maybe microbe photosynthesis in aquatic systems, but it certainly wasn't from the land plants. All right? So where did it all go once land is colonized by plants? On the edges, by the way, at first. It takes a long time to colonize land. At first, it's just experiments on the shores. So where did all this carbon go, the CO2? Stay tuned. We'll come back to that in our next segment and dig into it, so to speak, more. Okay, cheers. We'll see you next time.